Well, welcome to, I guess, what we call the new normal. But my name's Jeff Miller. I'm with Forefront Agronomy in Plainview, Texas, and going to visit with you today about the efficient water use in corn in West Texas. So we'll go ahead and get started. So today, some of the topics that we're going to cover would be plant water status, switching gears into the soil's importance in water management, talking about atmospheric demand for water, plant demand for water, infiltration, soil health, and irrigation management strategies. So the first thing we kind of wanted to get out of the way is just, what is water? Water is the most common substance found on Earth. It is the most universal solvent. It regulates the earth temperature, and plants are 90% water. And just a little tidbit of information that it's been estimated that an acre of corn transpires 4,000 gallons of water per day. So something to help you as we start thinking about managing this crop going into the future. So visiting with you a little bit about plant water status. It starts out, transpiration from a leaf is, determined by not only atmospheric demand, but the ability of the plant to pull water out of the ground and move it through that plant and out the leaves back into the atmosphere. And that's really kind of what is the driving force with how water moves in that plant. If water has a hard time making that work, the plant will adjust its metabolic rate in several forms and fashions to kind of avoid that loss of activity. And really, when we're talking about corn, it's whenever you see plants rolled up out there during the middle of the day. And really what that is just the plant's response to reduce the effect of solar radiation on that plant. So it rolls it up, closes the stomates, and sits around and waits until the water status changes. The role of water in a plant's life and really in ag production, doesn't matter what plant we're talking about, is to regulate functions. And so we just mentioned transpiration, but also in the transport of nutrients through that plant. But water is also a critical part of photosynthesis and is really considered a building block as far as that goes. That process can't happen without water, can't happen without light, can't happen without oxygen and carbon. And so kind of what that looks like is taking carbon dioxide and oxygen from the air, or water from the air, using light to convert that into carbohydrates, which we ultimately end up selling, and oxygen, which we ultimately end up breathing. And it's quite an in-depth process, and basically critical for life on this planet. And you can see in the diagram down here below, just kind of a depiction of that. But really, water only moves into the plant via the roots, and moves through the plant, via transpiration. So there's drivers of water status in plants, and the first one of that, and probably the most important, is uptake by the roots. And that happens through root exploration and is kind of regulated by the atmospheric demand on that plant. So digging into root exploration, first of all, roots have to penetrate into the soil, and they're going to continue to grow as the plant grows. And so it's really the main driver in moving water and nutrients into that plant. And so really, kind of how big those roots are and how much they are able to explore the volume of soil that they're rooted in depends on a number of conditions. One of them being the stage of plant development. Two being soil condition and whether we're dealing with any kind of compaction issues. How much water is available in the soil. And then finally, really what is the soil water holding capacity of that particular texture. And so how does this happen? Well, water is taken up into the roots through the root hairs, which you'll see here in the diagram. These little offshoots here, you see the blue arrows moving, which is water moving into the plant, and that happens through the root hair. There's tremendous amount of pressure that's created to be able to pull that water into the plant. As it pulls in, it moves into that xylem, moves up through the stem, into the leaves, and then out the leaves into the atmosphere. And quite a few forces that are working on it, in that particular realm. But water is not going to enter through the epidermis. It's not going to enter through the cortex. It's going to have to enter in through the root hairs. So it's very important that as we manage water, that we understand where our roots are at, that we have a good, healthy environment for those root hairs to be able to extract that water and keep those things healthy, so that that water continues to move into and up and out of the plant. As we think about water, we're not fortunate enough to live in a dry land or a no irrigation environment. We've got to have some irrigation to make our crops grow out here. And as we move through this thing today, I want you to think about putting yourself in the right mindset to utilize precision irrigation. And you may ask, well, what is precision irrigation? Well, the first thing that needs to be considered is the water needs of the plant. And there are different stages of that life of that plant that are going to require different amounts of water. Whenever it's young, it doesn't need very much. Whenever it's in full reproductive mode, it's using as much as it can. And then as it ages out, those demands come back down. We've got to understand what plant available water is out there, and that's going to come from the soil. We got to understand what the active root zone of that crop is, because if we've got plant available moisture but we don't have roots there to intercept it, then it really doesn't matter at that point in time. Now it may dictate how we make decisions going forward, but as far as looking at that today or over the next few days, if we don't have water in that root zone, then that's what we've got to pay attention to. One thing that often gets overlooked is the oxygen needs of the crop. Oxygen is a very important part of the process, and is vital to life. And we've got to account for the oxygen needs of that plant. And really, how is that water entering the soil? How is it bringing oxygen into that soil? And where is that oxygen available at? So, these are things that we want to pay attention to as we manage water. And then finally, being able to use irrigation to offset or optimize the weather. We live in a area with lots of extremes in weather conditions. And there's times of the year that we're that we have the ability to offset some of some hot weather, windy weather, whatever it may be. And then there's times of year that we need to manage our irrigation needs with the mindset of optimizing that weather that we do get. We're fortunate enough to catch that rain or something like that, and we don't want to shut that plant down by adding more water to it. And so just these are some of the things to think about as we continue to move through this and talk about managing irrigation in corn. So many of you probably already seen this graph, but I felt like it was very important to put back up there and just kind of giving you an idea of crop water needs for that particular crop that you're growing. And really it's no different for any crop that we're growing out here, whether it be cotton or corn or wheat. That plant starts off really small, has a really small root system, and is really not using very much moisture. And there's lots of opportunity on the early side of the growing season to take what moisture that we've got available there, let those roots go and explore, and be able to to grow and build as need be. As we move into some more critical time periods, when we're starting to set that ear size and that V6 time frame, our plants have gotten a little bit bigger, our root system's gotten bigger, and it's really important to understand that even though these things are growing, we're still not using a whole lot of water per day, and so that will adjust some of our irrigation needs, whether it be timing or amounts, and also just kind of understanding when to start. but kind of looking at what we're looking at here, what it's showing is, the green bar is how many roots are in that 8-inch zone. And then the brown zone is how many roots are in that 12-inch zone. And so, it's kind of a general rule of thumb at this stage of the game. If you got a plant 12 inches high, it ought to have roots 12 inches below. And so, being able to understand how much water do we have available, this is where our roots are at. And do we need to add anything to that, or is there enough moisture there to get us into the next stage? As that plant continues to grow, it's adding more biomass above ground, it's adding more biomass below ground. And we start monitoring that. We start understanding, how much water extraction is coming from that top 8 inches, the next, the 12-inch zone, and we should start seeing some roots tapping into that 20-inch zone. This is typically whenever we start cranking up irrigations, especially with our lighter capacity systems that we work with out here. We don't want to deplete that top of the moisture profile too much, because we want to be able to replenish that, but also understand that we've got moisture down below that, and as that plant continues to grow and explore into that soil volume, that we're able to pull moisture out of that. As we approach the vegetative stage or tassel, this is where we're going to reach the maximum plant size. We should be approaching the maximum size of our roots, and adjusting our irrigations accordingly. And as you can see, we're starting to extract water deeper. We're starting to spread that water extraction out across the top 2 feet, and really setting this plant up for success as it moves into the reproductive stage. As we get towards the end of the season, our goal is to have those roots as deep as possible, and we want to get there as quick as possible, because we need a good base underneath that plant to help us carry through stressful times of the season. And really, this red line here depicts at some point in the season we're going to exceed the water demands that we can supply through irrigation. And so we want to make sure that we've got a nice bank underneath us that we can tap into to bridge the gap between, whenever we are able to give that crop water, and be able to handle some of the heat, wind, and stress that's going to happen during that growing season. So it's very important that we monitor our roots throughout the growing season as we move along. And then, of course, as we get down towards the end of the season, as we're approaching maturity, those water needs fall off, and we want to be able to adjust our irrigation needs at that point. But really, it's all about setting up ourselves for success to hit that critical time period, those 2 weeks before tassel, 2 weeks after tassel, to ensure that we have a good kernel set, that we've got a good healthy plant going into that time period. But, back to thinking about precision irrigation, it's only the water in the root zone that counts. And that's going to affect how we manage an irrigated crop throughout the growing season, because we do have the ability to go out and supplement, some water during the season, and we want to make sure that we do that right. It's been proven that if we go out and we put on too much water, more water than that plant needs, and we push that field over field capacity, which generally can happen early in the growing season, we actually shut those roots down for 6 to 8 hours. And what we've done there is we've lost time, we've wasted energy trying to keep that plant moving along without adding anything to it. And so we want to be very careful with how we start those irrigations and then how we end those irrigations at the end of the season. Now, we do this by utilizing soil moisture sensors to track where those roots are at and how much water is being extracted from each individual level, and then being able to look at the atmospheric demands, such as the weather forecast, to be able to set in here and say, okay, we need to apply whatever, 1.5 inches this week to account for demand. So I've got a couple of examples here of some irrigation scenarios that we've run, and this is a drip irrigated cornfield in Floyd County, and worked with this producer for a number of years, and we've made some tweaks every year. And one thing that we've kind of settled on is not supplying irrigation water every day. We've gone to more of a 2 or 3 day period where we'll put out a heavier amount and then be off of that for a couple of days as it works through the zones in the field. And what that's doing is that's number one, bringing oxygen into the soil. But number two is that it is allowing that natural wetting and drying period to push those roots down below that drip tape. And we've got to be careful with how we manage drip irrigation, because if we put out too much, that plant's going to be lazy and it's going to think, well, I've got everything I need. It's going to hang out around that drip zone. And then we get into that stressful time period. It doesn't have a big enough root system to go and grab any of those extra nutrients or water that's below that tape. And so incorporating a program similar to this has been very successful over the last couple of years, and we've adjusted this as we've gone through the season and gone through some of the stress periods that we've got. But you notice here, we're not using much water. We're not using it very deep. It's all depicted by the stair-stepping pattern of each individual sensor. But we get out here to that June 14th time frame, we've pushed those roots below that drip line. And that's kind of the first leg of the race, and understanding where we need to be and where we need to start triggering some irrigations. As we move further into the season, into that June time frame, we see those roots go on down and get down into that 26-inch range. At this point, that corn plant is nearing its full maximum height. And it has all the leaves, all the stomates working on it, pulling moisture out of that ground. And so we want to be able to match up with that demand. And so we've kind of switched from an every third day to an every other day type scenario right there during that critical time period. We hit some significant heat there in July around the 12th, and you'll see some registers on the lower depths there at 30 and 36 inches. So, that tells me, okay, we've got, roots down there that if we need to go grab that moisture, we certainly can. The nice thing about drip is that we're going to put a little bit out every few days, and we're going to be able to replenish what we need. But, as we've gotten into the latter part of the season, we've stretched those intervals out and we've kind of weaned that plant off, and we're getting ready to harvest that any day now. Switching gears a little bit and looking at a pivot irrigated scenario out of Hale County. This is a lot of it's the same type of strategy. We're not going to irrigate a whole lot early on in the season. We want those roots to get down. We want them to go as deep as possible. And you'll see there around the 14th of June, we tapped into that about 14-inch zone. As we move on into early July, as that crop was approaching tassel, we were able to tap a little bit further down into that 22 to 26-inch range. There's definitely some things that we could do here to make some adjustments, because as you'll notice, we are seeing a rise in moisture in every zone, pretty much on every irrigation. And part of that's a testament to this operator's cultural practices to help his infiltration rates. But we want to make sure that we're only getting water down to where we need it, and that's where the roots are at. We do get some roots down deeper into the profile there in August, and we're in the dry down period right now. But just kind of giving you a snapshot of what that kind of looks like. This is a windshield wiper, so sometimes it's as we're moving around, we're getting a double whammy. So windshield wiper pivots are a challenge to work with, and it seems like we've got more and more of them, but there are ways to work around that. This corn crop was shared with corn, and as you'll notice there in late July, early August, our irrigation levels look a little bit different and intervals, and really that's as we change those irrigation amounts and move that into the cotton to be able to take care of both crops at the same time. Here's just an example of a crop that's been growing up on the North Plains, and just very similar. We were able to track those roots, and really did a good job of timing those irrigations and putting the amounts out there to get them down into where those active root zones are. You can see there in early June, we've got roots active down to 14 inches, and our irrigations are going down that far. We get into late June, our roots have gone down a little bit further. We were fortunate enough to catch a rain right in there, along with the irrigation, but we were able to to put that water where it needed to be in the root zone. And then as we get into mid-July, whenever that crop is starting to approach tassel, we've got roots registering all the way down to 36 inches. We've got the ability to grab that moisture if we need to, but you'll notice after that event that really most of our activity stays up in the upper part of the root zone. Now, we've gone through some significant heat, and really we didn't have to pull any of that moisture until we got into mid to late August. And but we were able to keep up with irrigations there, and we spread out those intervals and manage this in a precise manner. So we've talked a little bit about managing the crop. Understanding the atmospheric demand is very important whenever you start thinking about managing water, and it really is the amount of water that the atmosphere can hold. And it's evaporation is a driving force, and basically happens off the surface of either leaves or the soil, and is really the process of converting liquid into vapor, which in turn releases energy that ends up cooling that leaf off. Now, atmospheric demand is driven by the amount of energy directed on the surface, so direct sunlight, humidity of the air, wind speed, and temperature of the air. So we'll dig into that here in just a second. Now, we are fortunate enough, if you will, to be in an area that has one of the highest pan evaporation rates in the U.S., with the exception of Death Valley. We are at a high elevation here. We have a fair amount of bare soil. We have a lot of wind, and all of these factors play into the amount of evaporation that we've got to deal with. And we'll talk through some of the strategies and tactics to try to reduce the amount of evaporation, but it's something that we got to deal with out here on a yearly basis. So, digging into the components of atmospheric demand, number one is energy, and that comes from sunlight. And what happens is that sunlight heats the leaf surface and drives that evaporation process. And obviously, a sunny day is going to have more energy than a cloudy day. Another factor in atmospheric demand is humidity, which we don't have a whole lot of humidity out here for various reasons. But basically, they are a function of that gradient of water vapor between, that near 100% saturation of air in the leaf versus less than 100% saturation outside of the leaf. And, so it's something that we've got to account for. Temperature is very important, because as temperature rises, it increases the water holding capacity of the air, and that will affect, those evaporation rates. And then finally, wind speed, something that we deal with on a daily basis out here. It's basically the amount of air moving across that leaf surface, and what it ends up doing is it ends up creating a gradient that there is less moisture outside of the leaf than inside the leaf. So that's going to drive that transpiration rate and evaporation rate if there's water on the surface. So we live in an area that has lots of variability in weather, and there's variability whenever you look at year to year, and it's always interesting to look back at weather patterns. It seems like back in the day we had a wet year and then a dry year, kind of split them 50-50. And then it went to more of a every 2 years. We didn't get into a wet pattern until that third year. And right now it seems like it's even further than that. But being able to understand that we do have, weather setbacks that we've got to deal with, and being able to time your irrigations to offset those impacts from weather, but also be able to take advantage whenever it does turn off good. The role of climate on precipitation is I had a professor in college that always said, what's average? Well, you can stick your foot in a bucket of cold water and stick your foot in the other one in a bucket of hot water, and in the middle you'd be normal, you'd be average. And we talk about this area being an 18 to 19 inch rainfall area, but we've ranged anywhere from 3 to 4 inches on the low side to 30 or 40 inches on the high side. And the bad part about it is that it usually comes at the most inopportune times during planting and harvest. But being able to work towards offsetting that, be able to, there's new forecasting services out there that give us the ability to at least track trends and be able to, to make adjustments to that crop, whether it be planting dates, seeding rates, and our irrigation amounts that we're going to apply. So just looking at Hale County historical rainfall, just wanted to give you an idea when that rainfall occurs. And most of our rainfall happens in the summer months, whenever we've got a crop growing out there. And you look at these numbers and you say, well, that's not too bad, and I'd love to have this. But there's years that we don't. And really, as we get into managing water on a crop, we need to understand, what kind of normally happens. But we've got to be able to offset some of those stressful times with the irrigation that we've got available, and understanding that we don't store a whole lot of moisture, through the late fall and into the early spring. And so being able to set up a plan that's able to capture those smaller rainfall amounts and store those for later, and then be able to use those irrigation or those rainfall events that we get during the season. As we dig into the data a little bit deeper and understanding how our rainfall comes, most of it is less than 1/2 of an inch, and many of you would say that probably only half of what falls out of the sky is effective rainfall. And so you look at that, and it doesn't give you a whole lot of hope for those 1 or 2 inch rains that may come over the course of 100 years. We really don't have that many. And so, how do we account for that? What do we do? And that's part of the process of working with a water manager. So, switching gears a little bit, and we've kind of talked about the atmospheric demand. Well, now we're gonna go down to the soil and spend a little time understanding what goes on in the soil. And so whenever we talk about available water, the Webster dictionary version of this says that available water is water held in the soil between a 1/3 bar, which is low tension, to 15 bars of pressure, which would be very high tension. And these are made with laboratory tools and measured, and really kind of an in-depth process. But kind of an easier way to look at that is whenever we go and look at a soil, and as water enters it and it spikes and then it comes back down, just like on those graphs that we were showing, whenever it levels off, we call that drainage. And whenever we've kind of leveled off from that point until wilting point is available moisture. Now, we don't want to drive that crop down to the wilting point. We want to probably keep it in the upper half of that as we manage irrigation. And as part of what we work with, generally, most crops can be depleted by about 50%. And as an irrigation manager, we focus our efforts on corn to keep it only at a 25% depletion before we trigger an irrigation. But just something to kind of give you an idea. The other thing that matters whenever we're talking about available water in soil is what soil type that you're dealt with. If you've got some sandy type soils, you really don't have much water holding capacity. Now, you've got probably a fairly good amount of water infiltration just because those pore sizes are so big. But as we move into the more silty or more clay loam type soils, we we have a much bigger water holding capacity, and it's all based on soil particles now. The challenge there is getting the water into the ground where we can be able to use it. And so this picture here just kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking at. We're sands on the left, clays on the right, kind of your sweet spots in that silt and clay loam where we've got the most available water in there, and it's just a function of soil type. And we spend a lot of time throughout the the winter and the early spring, characterizing these soils, dragging an EC sled, pulling a soil sample out, and hand feel method to understand what soil types that we're dealing with, because this is a critical part of managing water. And what I've found is that with these more clay loam type soils, we're able to put on a bigger amount in less frequent applications, whereas we get into the sandier side of things, we're probably putting on less amount more frequently, and it's just a function of that soil type, and being able to understand that is very important. But kind of giving you an idea of what soils and available water could actually do for you. If you had available water in a 3-foot profile on 3 different soil types, there's quite a big range of available water there, from 3 inches to 7.5. And let's just assume that our corn crop's using 3/10 of an inch per day without any stress. That's enough water there in the soil to carry you for 10 days in the sand or 25 days in a silt loam. Now that's to full depletion, to that 50% mark. As we're starting to manage water, we'd probably want to cut those in half, and that's kind of where those more frequent events with less amounts on the sand works, versus in the more loamy type soils where we've got more holding capacity. We can put on more at one time and hold off before we need to get back around. So, everything in nature is all about balance, and it's no different whenever we talk about soil and water. And really just kind of give you a snapshot of what soil water content is either precipitation or irrigation, subtracted by our evaporation, transpiration, and drainage. And so just think of it as inputs is what you're going to put on it water wise. So whether we catch a rain or we spin that pivot around, versus how much are we losing due to evaporation, how much is moving through that plant and transpiration. And also one thing that kind of gets overlooked is how much water is moving through the profile that's not getting used. So we want to think about soil as a regulator, and it's really about the amount of water that's evaporated, transpired, and drained. All depends on these 3 factors. What is that soil water holding capacity of that different texture? What is the infiltration rate? And what level of compaction are we dealing with? And one thing that I've noticed over the last many years working out here is that we deal with a lot of infiltration problems. Our soils don't take water like they used to, and there's some things that we'll discuss on maybe how to fix that. And then with every soil moisture sensor that we put in the ground, we take a soil compaction reading, and I would say on the average most of us hit a fairly root restrictive zone in that 18 to 20 inch zone. And the thing to think about that is, how are you going to alleviate that kind of compaction at that depth? Because we don't have tractors big enough to go out there and plow that up. So being able to utilize roots, biological amendments, and water to help alleviate some of that compaction will help us out. And then those things also help along with that infiltration rate. But keep in mind that the soil can only supply as much water as it can hold. It's like it's taking a cup of water here, and when it's full and you pour more water on it, you're not getting any good out of it. You're just making a mess. And it's really no different how we manage our irrigation, and understanding what that soil can hold is very critical with how we will manage that irrigation going forward. There's many differences among soils as it's related to texture. We've got to account for evaporation, especially early in the season before we see a canopy closure. And in many cases, we've seen soil depleted 4 or 6 inches with the amount of wind and the amount of solar radiation that we deal with out here. But then also understanding the transpiration rates as it moves water from deeper in the soil, and we pay attention to that. As far as soil water losses, um, drainage is the movement of water through the profile, and I see this a lot of times, especially early in the season. We go out there, we put on a heavy amount of irrigation, and we push that water all the way through the root zone and past. And really, it's water that hopefully we're going to be able to capture later on in the year, but in many cases, we never get to that point. And so we want to be able to adjust those irrigation amounts to be able to, to hit right there where those roots are at, keep those things active and growing and moving along. Evaporation is the loss of water from the soil surface. So anything that we can do to reduce that amount can help us in the long run, because we're able to store more water there that will be available for the plant. There's not much we can do about transpiration. It is what it is. That's what that plant has to have to stay alive, just like you've got to have water to stay alive. And but we can understand when those transpiration rates are going to be lower or higher, depending on weather conditions, depending on crop stage, and that's kind of how we work through it. Digging into evaporation a little bit further is just, evaporation's the process of converting liquid water to vapor. And in this process, we release energy, which cools the leaves. This evaporation can happen basically from any surface, and soil water evaporation is affected by the presence of crop residue on that soil surface. So anything that we can do to keep that ground covered is going to help us alleviate or take the E out of ET, is what a lot of guys say. So looking at crop residues, there's been lots of studies and showing that they have two major roles. One of them is to reduce the evaporation rate by as much as 80% compared to a bare soil. And we've been able to to notice this over the years as we've monitored fields in various different situations. And one other thing that they do is they intercept rainfall or irrigation drops. And basically what happens is it just creates a barrier, and it kind of breaks up the energy of that raindrop, and lets it kind of dissipate as it moves through the residue, and then just kind of lays down on the soil in a nice soft fashion, and really retains that soil aggregate stability, giving us the ability to not only to reduce the evaporation amounts, but also get more water into the ground. And this is just kind of an idea here. It's not the greatest picture because there's no difference between the two. But looking at the top picture here, where we're looking at the energy balance of a minimum residue with a wet soil. You've got lots of incoming solar radiation. You've got lots of evaporation of water. In the process of that, we're actually cooling that soil down a little bit. And we're not warming the air, and so we see some things happen there versus where we do have more cover out there, more residue to work with. We still got the same amount of incoming radiation, but we've reduced that evaporation of water. We've actually kept the soil at a good constant temperature, which is excellent for soil microbial activity. And then we actually warm the air off, and what that does is create a microclimate that plant can really optimize everything from solar radiation to water to temperature to enhance its growth. So thinking about water as it moves into plants, we've talked about the soil. Let's move into plants, and really water can only move into the plant via the soil, like I mentioned before. This happens in really three different ways, through water vapor, through hydrostatic pressure, and through water potential. And all of these act to move water into the plant from those root hairs into that root, into the stem, out the leaves, and into the atmosphere. So, transpiration really happens in a couple of different stages, and it boils down to there's got to be a concentration gradient. And so whenever those stomates open, they're releasing water vapor into the atmosphere. It is triggering a gradient that moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. So from the leaf out into the atmosphere. And what that does is that triggers that pressure that is moving water into the roots, up through the stem and out the leaves. And then, also, there's other things such as capillary action. Those xylem vessels are actually really small. It'd be like sucking a straw. You're able to move water up through it, and just be able to, all three of these things work together to move water through that plant. And its main function is to cool and to move nutrients and water to plant parts that need it. As it gets to the leaf, here's a nice picture of what a stomate looks like. And there's guard cells around that cell, and they open and close as needed. And if that plant's sensing stress, it's going to close that up. It's going to roll those leaves and really kind of reduce the amount of solar radiation. But the problem with that is that we're creating higher temperatures in the leaf, because we're not breathing correctly, and we're not converting light into carbohydrates at the rate that we should, because of those things being closed off. So very important, dynamic system that we work with, and being able to understand that as a water manager is critical. I mentioned infiltration, and really, in agriculture, our success depends on getting water into the soil. It doesn't do us any good whenever it runs off down into the ditch and down the county road. We've got to get it into the soil, into that active root zone, so that plant can use it. So, when we think about infiltration rate, it's the rate of precipitation or irrigation water that moves into the soil, and it's the ability of those soil aggregates to withstand the impact of that continual exposure to being wet. It's a very vital process. And so what generally happens whenever we have poor infiltration rates, we have a low wet aggregate stability. Those bonds that hold those soil aggregates together, so you kind of think of them as little crumbles in the ground. As they break apart, those sand, silt, and clay particles kind of flocculate out, and they end up plugging pores, and then that's where we get a problem with infiltration. Where we have good soil aggregate stability, that we don't get that shrinking and swelling effect as much. We're not flaking things off, and we're able to move that water into the ground where it needs to be, below that zone that's going to be evaporated, and put it into the root zone where it can be used. So this is kind of an example here. As a rainfall drop or an irrigation drop falls to the surface, and you have low soil aggregate stability, you have the ability, what you're doing is you're breaking those apart, and you're really, plugging these pores. And what happens is that ground seals off, water ends up running off, and it takes forever for it to infiltrate. We've done lots of infiltration studies using multiple methods, and we found where this ground is, not as stable as others, that, it's taken upwards of 18 hours to soak in an inch, versus on the right-hand side, where you've got better aggregate stability. You're not flocculating those particles off and plugging those pores. That water can move into the ground, go where it needs to be. That's happening in less than an hour for an inch, and which is not great, but it's better than it would be otherwise. There's definitely improvement. There's parts of this country that can soak in 4 to 6 inches in an hour. We're probably more in that half to an inch an hour, and most of our rains fall in about 20 minutes, it seems like. Compaction is often one of the most forgotten factors, and really, we don't think about it a whole lot in cotton, but whenever we start dealing with grass crops such as corn and sorghum, it really rears its head, and is really kind of a testament to things that have happened in the past. Tillage patterns, traffic patterns across the field, and just a natural, the ability of the soil to open up, and it's directly related to some of those infiltration issues. As I said, what it is what we're doing is we're limiting the amount of water that's available to that plant, and it's really probably more of a function that those roots can't get through that compacted layer, So they never had the chance to fully explore that profile for extra nutrients, extra water. And we end up having, a shallow root system that we're going to have to account for. And in many cases, whenever we see this out in the field, we want to make sure that we're adjusting our irrigation methods to more of a frequent pattern, because we just don't have the soil volume to work with. I've gone out, we've taken these penetrometer readings in many fields, and like I said, we generally hit a pretty compacted layer in that 18-inch zone. And then it kind of opens back up below that and then hits another one in about that 30 to 36-inch zone. So, there's things that can be done to help alleviate that, but they don't happen overnight. And so the best way to do that is to avoid ever getting into that situation in the first place. Here is a field that that last one that we talked about, that we had such good movement of roots down. This field has a major compaction issue due to excessive traffic during harvest, trying to get corn out of the field. And where we've hit that layer is somewhere in that 22-inch zone. And you'll notice that down here in the bottom, there is virtually no rooting activity happening down there in that zone. And so we've had to adjust our irrigation amounts and timings on this field to be able to account for that. Knowing that from the get-go kind of helped us get started. But one thing that I did notice is that we are actually increasing moisture in that bottom profile, but we're not able to utilize it because we can't get our roots down there. And so it can be very detrimental, especially if we catch this too late as we start managing water. Good soils are going to equal good yields. You take care of the ground, it's going to take care of you. And this is just an example of, up in the Midwest, they've got an index that's basically a corn production index, and is tied directly, related to soil texture and soil health. And as you notice, as those numbers get better, so do our yields. And I think that we can mimic the same thing down here with some of the things that we're able to do, but we've got to start that process. So thinking about soil health and water, really these things are directly related, and is really kind of what's driven my interest over the last few years, is being a water manager and noticing these different systems and how crops are able to withstand stress in a more healthy situation. Warrants us to visit about it. And so, visiting about soil health, it's really the impact of, it's got a big impact on water, and really is the focus of carbon in our soil, as well as diversity. And really what that diversity is going to be able to do to bring to your farm is a continual supply for food for microbial populations. There's millions of these things down there, and but they got to eat just like us, just like your cows. And so they've got to have something to eat. So we want to make sure that we put them in a good environment, supplying organic matter to create those more stable aggregates, so we can get that water into the soil, we can hold more water. And then finally, recycling of those nutrients down below the soil surface in that root zone to help promote better plant growth and basically help us withstand these stressful time periods that we're going to experience during the growing season. And so thinking about, what does soil health mean? One of the basics is just keeping that ground covered. And really there's three advantages to that. Number one is reducing the impact of that rainfall or that irrigation drop as it hits the soil, and being able to maintain our soil aggregation and improve our infiltration. One of the obvious things is reducing the amount of evaporation, so that plant can use it for transpiration instead of it going off into the atmosphere. And then finally, as we create a better environment, especially in that upper surface, then we have more shallow roots there that are able to capture these smaller rainfall events that we talked about earlier, or these irrigation events as they come across, and be able to open up. And you've got a temperature barrier out there that keeps those microorganisms working in harmony with everything. This is a process, and and it doesn't happen overnight. But there's lots of things that are going to happen in the first steps of this process that you're probably not going to see a whole lot of benefit from, at least above ground. The biological activity, that organic matter turnover. But once those processes start kicking on all cylinders, then we start seeing a little better improved nutrient cycling, which means that you're going to have a healthier plant, maybe even be able to reduce some of your inputs. Then we work into that improved soil structure, which ultimately leads into improved water availability. And it's all about having the right food and carbon supply, having the right amount of water, the right amount of air, and really just sheltering it, just like your house. So things that we want to avoid is intensive tillage, and this area has done a great job of reducing the amount of tillage that we do. But anytime that we drag a plow through the ground, we are reducing that soil carbon in that upper soil surface where that plow is run, which ultimately leads to that instability of soil aggregates, which causes problems with compaction, causes problems with infiltration, and really just creates a just an unfair environment for that plant to live in. Are there practices that we can affect our soil health as it relates to water? There's definitely two sides of the coin here. One of them being the negative is tillage. Having limited crop diversity and rotations, removing that crop, excessive crop removal, and applying excessive chemicals. But where we can positively impact our soil health is improving our crop diversity. Having some crop rotations. Maybe it's looking into cover crops. Maybe it's reducing the amount of tillage, and there's also other things such as incorporating livestock, bio-based nutrients, these kind of things that can help improve that soil health, and really kind of follows the 5 principles of soil health that are preached by the NRCS. So as we think about water use efficiency, really it's the ability to convert water into plant biomass that we can actually harvest and get paid for. And it's expressed as the amount of biomass per unit of water, so yield per inch of water in our case. And really we want to consider our water use efficiency as the amount of water we invest into that crop to achieve an economic return. And our goal in agriculture is to produce the biggest amount of return on our investment of our natural resources. And this is a natural resource that is not renewing. And we need to be able to take advantage of as much of it as we can. And that's really kind of where we've come into the realm from a water management standpoint, to be able to understand that plant's going to tell us what it needs, and based on the season that it is, we're able to adjust those irrigation amounts, those irrigation rates, and timing to line up with what that crop is going to need at any given time, and to get the biggest return for our buck. Soil health as it impacts water use efficiency, basically we can increase productivity by reducing that crop stress. And this is all a system. It's not just one thing that we're going to be able to do. Being able to manage that irrigation to those plant needs, understanding where those roots are at, where the water's at, where's that active root zone, is very important. But also being able to hold on to whatever we can from a cover standpoint, from a improving that soil health to help us make it through those stressful situations. So, really two ways of looking at this: reducing the amount of water stress because there's more water available, and also more water is used for transpiration because that soil evaporation has been reduced. And anything that we can do to keep that water moving through the plant, keep that plant cool, is going to put that into a nice, happy environment that's going to end up paying off in the end. As it relates to nutrient use efficiency, it's really the same principles. It can give you a return on your investment, maybe even reduce the amount of inputs that you're putting out. But it boils down to you've got a bigger root system out there that's able to access more nutrients that are naturally available. And we can get that plant working, optimizing its productivity. So it really plays into that. And then that's kind of where we lead into this. We're not only paying attention to what water does in the ground, but what nutrients. And it's fully a function of what those roots look like, where they're at, where that moisture profile is. And if we can keep that moisture profile and that temperature profile in the root zone at an optimal range, then all the microbial activities working on all cylinders, and we've got a big enough bank to go pull these nutrients in this water from to create a healthier plant that's going to be able to withstand stress. We go from wet to dry and dry to wet every growing season. And something that we want to think about is as that soil surface dries, then there's less water to evaporate, and the amount of energy used for latent heat decreases. But that energy then goes into heating the soil and the air instead of heating the plant. And I've seen temperatures in the spring and the summertime on bare soil reach 120, 130 degrees, and microbial life dies at 130. And so anything that we can do to reduce the amount, that effect, and just kind of switch the gears, instead of, heating the atmosphere, we want to heat those plants and be able to drive that transpiration process. And we've all seen it, these high temperatures during the growing season creates a microclimate around that plant, and it can be quite a harsh environment for it to try to survive. And waiting for a week for that irrigation to get back around is not what that plant needs. So anything that we can do to offset that. Looking at what we're looking at here, we've got a good healthy plant up here at the top. And what we've got going on, we're collecting that radiation, we're transferring that that light energy by using CO2 and water into carbohydrates that we're going to actually harvest and sell off of that crop. And we're not pushing off as much heat. We're not pushing as much heat down into the soil. And I know a lot of people don't like walking cornfields, but I do. And you get in there, and it is pretty humid, but it is slightly cooler than what the outside temperature is, versus walking into a crop that's drought stress. You've got more solar radiation hitting, not only the plants but the soil surface. You've actually reduced your transpiration rates, and in turn you're reducing your photosynthetic activity, which in turn reduces the amount of carbohydrates that we're gonna grow, and we're starting to release more heat, which this just compound effects across the entire region. As we transition from adequate water to limited water, I mean, this is pretty much every season that we're in. We generally start out with well capacities that can handle the crop stage, but at some point we get to that point that we're not able to refill what that plant's used. And so we need to make sure that we've got moisture in the ground and roots that are able to go out and extract it. And really it boils down to an energy balance that changes and switches from heating the plants and driving that transpiration to heating the air and reducing the amount of transpiration. It's almost a total flip-flop. The implications of this really kind of boils back down to what we talked about earlier, is that those soil type differences are going to have different water holding capacities, and you're going to start seeing a lot of yield variation across that farm as we start seeing that heating effect. And really, as it moves into grain fill, that's one of the most critical times of that plant's life, and really what your whole livelihood is based off of. Soils with low water holding capacity, are going to exhibit the first signs of stress with limited rainfall or irrigation, and it's going to be pronounced because that is the highest water use of the season. But the overall effect of this is a reduction in grain yield in fields with soil with that low water availability. And so, there's some things that we're doing to help offset that. And one thing that we've focused a lot of efforts on in not only corn but cotton is looking at variable rate irrigation, and we've incorporated the speeding up and slowing down that pivot based on soil dynamics, soil type, texture, EC, all these kind of things that don't change, that we know that, we know what the potential of that ground is, but we also understand that there's parts of that field that are producing well that we probably haven't hit our potential yet. And it's because that ground is doing things better. It's holding more water. It's got more microbial activity, and maybe we need to push those sides of the farm a little bit more. And so being able to reallocate where we're putting our resources and getting the biggest bang for our buck, and really kind of evening out the profitability across that farm. We deal with wind, we deal with heat coming off that southwest edge, and maybe there's some things that we can do there from a variable rate irrigation standpoint to be able to, to offset that somewhat. So there's ways that we've gone about this and been very successful doing. Looking at the opportunity of what that field can yield is really based on those unchangeable soil variables. What is that soil type, that texture, that slope? And so being able, we go out, we collect this information, we understand it, and set forth a plan. As we understand that, we're able to, to devise a plan and adjust accordingly as the crop needs it, as the weather conditions change, and be able to put that water where it needs to be, and take that water off where it doesn't need to be, and ultimately kind of optimizing every region of that field. And ultimately, at the end of the day, being able to smooth out that yield map, and be able to to actually improve profitability on that whole farm by a number of reasons. One, we've been able to reduce some of our inputs in some parts of the field, and in other parts we've actually increased our inputs, but we've got an even bigger return for that investment as we move through it. So just kind of looking through here, that opportunity within those unchangeable variables such as soil, looking at our EC, which is soil texture over here on the left, versus, landscape changes, and, being able to, to offset that. Looking at the right amount of water in the right place. Unfortunately, this is not from here. This is from further north from some of my counterparts. But looking at these different soil types out there depicted by the different colors, in the little boxes at the top is the amount of irrigation that was put on every pass, and then the black is the yield that we were able to achieve. And looking at what we were able to do across that field with really not a lot of difference in water, about 0.2 of an inch difference from the low to the high, but we were able to smooth out that yield map, be able to really get yields producing where they need to be in each part of the field. As we dig in here a little bit closer, looking at that 0.9 of an inch, we were able to make nearly 305 bushels on this particular field, whereas out here on the high end where we put a 1.11 inch, we only made 301. Sometimes more water doesn't always equal more yield, so keep that in mind. But the goal is to optimize that growth system to equal more yield in all areas of the field. We deal with windshield wipe pivots out here, and thinking through how we manage that. A lot of times we end up getting stuck because we're backing that pivot up. We're putting too much water on in parts of it, not enough in the middle of the field. And so there's ways to develop different strategies to kind of offset that. Number one, we'd be able to to even that yield out by spreading the water out accordingly. We're not overwatering in any part of the field at any given time, so we're not dealing with pivots getting stuck. And ultimately, what we've seen is an increase in yield because of what we've been able to accomplish there. So kind of getting down here to the end and just thinking about some different strategies as we move into setting forth a plan and growing corn here in West Texas. Kind of threw together some different scenarios with how we might look at different irrigation amounts. And so depending on what soil type that you may have out there, going from an inch application to an 1.5 inch application is going to be directly tied to how much water you can actually get in the ground at any given time. You'll notice here that I've got some things highlighted as we planted that crop, we put out smaller amounts early on in that growing season, because that's what that plant needed. It didn't need more than that. You don't have an extensive root system. You don't have a bunch of above ground biomass. And so being able to kind of time those irrigations out as needed. Looking at planting data as it affects water use. We ran some scenarios here looking at a late March planting all the way up to June planting, and really at each date that we moved further into the season, we're actually reducing the amount of water that plant needs, and it's really a function of temperature. We're able to hit our growth stages much quicker, much more efficiently as temperatures warm up, and we actually reduce the amount of time that crop is out there exposed to it. If you remember back early, whenever we talked about rainfall patterns, we time ourselves up a lot better with the rainfall that generally happens out here. So, there are some things there that we can do to reduce the amount of water that crop's going to need by adjusting our planting dates. And then finally, looking at different maturity dates, and looking at a short season versus a long season. Obviously the shorter season plants are going to use less water because they're out there less. They're not out there as long. This coupled with some planting dates, we can really do some pretty fantastic things and shave some water off of that plant's needs. And so, there's lots of different strategies going forward, trying to grow corn in this area. We're also evaluating different seeding rates, and I'm not convinced that by planting different seeding rates that we have reduced the actual amount of water that we're using, but we are building bigger, robust plants, root systems, and we've got better air movement through the plants, and we're able to move that water into the plant to do what we need to do, and just be more efficient with what we have. So finally, just thinking through, how we go about making irrigation decisions, and the more the better. And so being able to collect information from that ground, understanding what water is available, what water, where those roots are at, where those irrigation or rainfall events are getting to in the soil, to be able to make those adjustments. Being able to utilize analysis and models to predict when that crop is going to need more water, when is that crop going to receive some rainfall or some cooler weather, and then being able to work with some boots on the ground people to help you make those management decisions. And really it boils back down to a couple of different things. What we don't know that could be influencing our profits. How much water is available, when's the right time to put water out, or how do we adjust after a rainfall event. What nutrient efficiencies are we working with, and are there new technologies that we can implement to help us along this process? Can we save some money along the lines? If we save 1 or 2 inches on that pivot, how much money is that in your pocket? And if we don't see a drop in yield, then that's money in the bank to be able to use somewhere else. But what we're focusing on is optimizing that root development, improving our soil health, and conserving our nutrients. And then finally working with somebody that's out in the field, puts their eyes on it and uses the technology to be able to help put the pieces of the puzzle together for you at the end of the day. So with that, I will open it up for any kind of questions. Once again, my name is Jeff Miller with Forefront Agronomy. You can reach me at my website there, forefrontagronomy.com, or email me at forefrontagronomy@gmail. Would be glad to visit with anybody putting forth plans going into 2021 as they're looking at growing this corn plant.